Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all here today. So as Chris was saying, quite a few changes going on in the world today. Tomorrow, Donald Trump is becoming the 47th president of the United States. And you can see he's making a huge impact, on many things going on in the world, not just on a world level, but also on a national level. So our own government is having to rethink lots of things, hopefully in the right way, now that Donald Trump will be the president. But also he mentioned, you can see in Korea, South Korea, then the president there has just been arrested. And again, it's an unusual thing to happen. And also in our own community, we're looking for a new national leader, because Mike Balcom's been the national leader for 4 years, and he's very lucky. The reason is because our constitution says national leader's the leader for 4 years, and then they can either be reappointed or that somebody else can replace them. So he's really happy, the fact we have a constitution now. Because in the past, once you became the national leader or any leader, it just went on and on and on and on. And poor old Tim Reed, I think, was the national leader for about 14 years, so he got burnt out. And so it's much better to think these things through. So I thought, well, since this seems to be a thing, I'll talk about this a bit. So this is one of the things it says in the Bible. When Moses is receiving the commandments at Mount Sinai, and then he spoke a lot about lots of things. So this is one of the things he said just before the end, before they went into Canaan. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. So it's kind of interesting here. They're setting off into Canaan, and God isn't saying you have to have this, this, and this, and this, and be organized in this and this and this way. God says, if you yourselves decide to have a king. In other words, it's not compulsory to have a king. It's something which they have to decide themselves how they want to organize their own political structures. So political structure wasn't actually decided at Mount Sinai. It's something that God says you have to organize these things yourself. You yourself have to take responsibility for the way that your own community and nation is going to be governed and run. You've got to work it out for yourself what is the best thing to do. But make sure you appoint over a king the Lord your God chooses. So again, how is God going to make that kind of choice? Okay, different ways in which God might be choosing or making people aware of it, but that's the point. You have to choose someone who is going to be trustworthy, reliable, and is going to know things which need to be known. Also, do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. That's an interesting thing. It's something that becomes a problem if you do, but sometimes it actually worked out well. In England, we ended up appointing George I because we ran out of English people. And he was from Germany, and he couldn't speak English. So he came over here, became George I, King of England, because before that he was the King of Hanover, and through birth he was the most appropriate person. But because he couldn't speak English, that meant the Parliament had to make all the decisions themselves. And so Parliament then became more, instead of waiting for the king to tell them what to do, they had to decide these things themselves. So it's interesting how these things work out. Anyway, so how is who the leader is decided? Well, one way, as I said, it could be inherited. And that's often the way that it is the monarch. And the first person who becomes a king is usually someone who's a warrior. Why is that? Well, when people live in a sort of rural, peaceful, quiet environment, they don't need a leader because they're all just getting on with life as a family and as a community. But when you get some other tribe, those days it's usually a tribe, comes along, decides to invade your country and steal your land and your house and put you to death or make you and your community into slaves, people have to decide, what are we going to do? We need someone who's going to lead us into fight against this invading tribe. And so that's why the leaders were always warriors. And you can still see this in the British tradition. The king is always someone who's been in the defense forces. Yeah, and there's a very strong element there of the idea that the king is there to defend a country and protect a country. And so it became a monarchy, and then it became an inherited. So I have to decide, well, okay, so this is the person who's the leader, and when he dies, who's going to replace this person? Real problem. And so, sometimes people compete because they want to become the next king or the next ruler. And so often you would get into civil wars and all kinds of fighting between people, different families or different tribes, to try to become the next ruler. And so they decide, well, the easiest thing to do is if the son, as he always was in those days, the son, at least a descendant of the current ruler, becomes the next ruler. And then we're not going to argue about it. Then it stays within that particular family, within that particular thing. And nobody's arguing about, well, we want to become the next ruler. Well, I'm sorry you can't, because you're not the current king or queen's son or daughter. So that settles that kind of argument. So that works out quite well. It's very tough, though, for that particular family. If you're born the first son or daughter of the king, the monarch, you don't have much choice in life. You can't say, well, I'm going to go and pursue this career or that career or the other career. Oh, I think I'm going to emigrate and go and live in another country. All those options are cut off from you. There's only one door to walk through. You have to prepare yourself to become the next ruler, the next king. Whether you like it or not. That's just the way it is. So it's not easy being a member of a royal family. Not easy being a member of the true family. You can see, some of the children quite comfortable, but most of them actually packed their bags and gone. Hasn't worked out particularly well. So it's very, very difficult then. So one of the advantages then, if you're born into the royal family, you learn how things work. You learn how things work because you're brought up to become that kind of a person. Your whole education is about how to prepare you to become the next king or queen. And so when you become the next king or queen, then you just carry on. Whereas if you become the president of a nation, you've just been elected to become the president, you become the ruler, and you have to do lots of things, but you have no idea what to do. Because you have got no background or experience. You have to learn. And so the first time when Donald Trump was elected, it was quite chaotic because he hadn't been the president before and he didn't know how it worked. And he went through lots of different people who he appointed and fired and appointed and fired. Second time round, he knows how things work. So he's already prepared and things are going to work much better. And it's the same when Charles became the king. It's just like one day to the next, nothing changed. He'd been preparing for this role for the last 60 years. He's in his 70s now. But he'd been preparing this, and he just slipped into it. He already knew everything about everybody and everyone and how things work. So it's very, very convenient like that. He already knows everybody in the country, knows all the different rulers around the world for the last 40 years. He met them all personally. He's traveled all around the world. So there's a huge amount of wisdom there. And you could say the same about the late Queen Elizabeth. She is the wisest person in the world. She'd been to every single country in the world, pretty much. She met every single ruler in the world since the 1940s, in America, and other places in Britain and Europe. So she's able to give a lot of advice and wisdom and guidance to prime ministers and to the government. So that's one way you can do it. You can inherit it. And you have to hope that the family's going to be that kind of a family. A good family. Another way is to elect somebody. And so the Americans decided they got a bit fed up with the way it was. They became independent, and they decided, well, we're going to have a constitution, which they didn't have in England, still don't, and we're going to elect a president. And it worked out relatively well, But as you look at the world today, where there are elections, you can see the huge problems. Because when someone is elected, they're elected by a particular half of the country. The other half of the country might hate them. And we can see this is what's been going on in America for quite a few decades now, especially at least since the time of Nixon, I guess. I can't remember who was before Nixon. A bit too young. Anyway, so one party would win the election, the leader of that particular party became the president, and everybody in the other party was against that person. And you can see this with Donald Trump, you could see it with Biden, you could see it with Obama, you could see it with Clinton. It was the sense that when you have a monarch, that can represent the entire country. So no one says that the king or the queen in this country is on one side or another. Even though the king is the head of the Church of England, he visits and gets to know all the different religious leaders within the country, all the different communities within the country. He doesn't think, I just represent half the country, the people who elected me. So that's a problem when you have a democracy, you have someone who's elected. They're always thinking about the next election, and they have to think, okay, I have to have policies so that I'm going to get re-elected. Or the party has to think about getting re-elected the next election, so we have to make sure we're going to get at least half the country on our side. So that becomes a problem. And you can see that in the way it is in America today. It has been for several decades, actually. And you can see the same in France. What's going on there. You can see the same in Germany. You can see the same in quite a few different countries, this kind of problem. So it's not necessarily the best way of doing things. So then, that means then, if you are elected, it means you have to think, okay, we've been elected, I've been elected, or our party's been elected, but we're not here just to represent the people who elected us. We have to think, well, we have to represent the entire country, which is the mindset of a monarch. Yeah. And so if you look at the current government in Britain, the Labour Party got about 30% of the people who voted for Labour. Is that a majority? No. So if they think, we won the election, therefore we can do whatever we want, well, actually, 70% of the country didn't vote for you. They voted for Conservative or Reform or Greens or Liberal Democrats. So you have to think, okay, we might have won the most seats in Parliament, but actually only a minority of the people who voted for us. Therefore, we have to make sure that our policies are ones that are going to take care of the entire country, not just the people who elected us, which are mostly the public sector. Yeah, have to think about everybody else as well. So that's important responsibility for somebody who becomes a leader, thinking, okay, I'm not just there to represent the people who voted me in, I have to think and have the mindset of representing the entire country. Or somebody can be appointed. So that happens a lot. And then if you're appointed, then you think, okay, I am then... If you're elected, then you're thinking, okay, I have to listen to the people who voted me in, because they think I'm a good person. They voted me in, so I have to take their interest into consideration. Whereas if you're appointed, you think, okay, my authority doesn't come from the people who I'm leading. My authority comes from the person who appointed me. Different way of thinking. I have to make the person who appointed me happy, otherwise they might fire me. Different way of thinking. Okay? And leads to a different kind of way of doing things. Another way, person become a leader, they just decide they don't like the way things turned out at the election, or they don't like the person who is the leader, so they stage a coup. That's what the communists did in 1917, and various other people did that too. Okay, so these are different ways in which you decide a leader. So we're deciding another leader now in the UK. So people have been asked to think about somebody who they might like to to be the next national leader. Has to be somebody, obviously, who's British, because you have to be able to live in the country. And so you have to think, well, what's the best kind of person? The person who can, have this kind of sense of responsibility and sense of vision and various other things. And, And of course, you might decide to recommend somebody, but then if you get a letter or phone call, oh, you've been recommended to be the next national leader, you have to think, do I really want to do that? And then that person has to then decide what they're thinking about doing. It's the way it works. You have to be careful what meetings you go to. You might end up getting appointed to something you don't want to do. So what is leadership? It begins basically with taking responsibility. And so what's responsibility? It just means ability to respond. It's just two words, response and ability. You have the ability to respond. So what are you responding to? You're responding to the world in which, you're responding to the reality of the world in which you live. Something might happen around you that you can see happening. You have to decide, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? I have the ability to respond, to do something, or just decide not to do anything at all. So, for example, you can see that with Moses. He was a prince of Egypt, brought up in the palace, with incredible wealth, incredible power, incredible prestige, and he's wandering around the building site where Hebrews are building the pyramid, the city and buildings, and he saw a slave driver beating a Hebrew. Then he had to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to just walk past on the other side and ignore it? He could have done that. That's one way to respond. Or he could have decided to think, oh, this is what's happening here is not right. I need to try and get involved and try and do something about it. And that's what he did. And he intervened. So it's about making decisions. And another time he went into the desert, and he was getting a bit thirsty, so he tracked down a well. When he arrived at the well, there were half a dozen women there with the sheep, watering the sheep. And then a gang of thugs came along and started harassing the women that were there. And he had to decide, what am I going to do? Maybe I'll just walk away and come back in half an hour when it's all over and done with. But he didn't do that. He thought it's not right that this should be happening. And he got involved and he beat up the thugs and rescued the women. So that was the kind of person he was. And so if you're a leader, the most important thing you have to do is to make decisions. And the important thing is to be able to make the good decision. Most important thing. If you've got a leader who might be a very nice person, but doesn't make good decisions, then it's incredibly frustrating, or decides not to get involved at all. So that's very important then, about being responsible, about taking decisions, getting involved in the way you need to get involved, and to solve problems, basically be a problem solver. But also another thing is no one can lead alone. It is not good to be alone. It says that twice in the Bible. Anybody know when it says it? Any guesses? Sorry?
Just at the beginning of human history.
Beginning of human history, when was that?
Yes, so one person is not...
Who was the first person then? Adam, that's right. And so, anyway, in this particular story in the Bible, it says God created Adam first, and they said it's not good for him to be alone. Lots of animals appeared, and he got on well with the animals, but he's couldn't find one that was really he could connect to deeply. And then God created Eve to be his spouse. So God said it's not good to be alone. Okay, any other time when that phrase appears in the Bible? So Moses became the leader, but then after they left Egypt, then he was sitting in a chair, and every day, for hours and hours and hours, people used to come and visit him and ask him to decide different problems that they were having. And his father-in-law came along, Jethro, to visit him, and Jethro said, "You're going to get worn out. You're going to get burnt out if you sit here every day all by yourself making all these decisions." Thousands and thousands of people are queuing up and asking him questions and wanting a decision, an answer. And he said to Moses, you're going to get burnt out. It's not good to be alone. It's not good to be a ruler by yourself. You get worn out. You need a team. And so Jethro, who's a patron saint to management consultants, he said you have to you have to divide all the Israelites up. And for every group of 100, you have to have one person who's the leader, who can make all these decisions. And within the 100, you have to divide it up into 2 groups, 2 50s, and then one person over every 50, and divide the 50s up into other groups of 10s. And so every group of 10 had one person who was a leader or decision maker. Every group of 50 had somebody, so it's 5 groups of 10, and et cetera, works its way up like that. So in the end, one person out of every 8 adults amongst the Hebrews had some kind of position of responsibility to solve problems. And so instead of waiting for justice, for years sometimes, as is in this country, it could all be sorted out very quickly. And any problems that appeared could be sorted out quickly. And if the leader or judge of that particular group of 10 didn't know the answer, then you go and ask the person who was responsible for that bigger group of 50, et cetera. And that's just the way it worked. And that's why they're able to make their way into Canaan. Because instead of just having one person, had a team. They're very important then. And then Moses had a team. Closest team was his older brother, Aaron, and his sister Miriam. So they supported him and they helped him. And it all worked together very well. And so the same thing happened in this country as well. You had a king, but then sometimes the nature of kings, being lots of fallen nature, they want to have the power and authority to make all the decisions by themselves. And there's one particular king called Charles I who said, I have the divine right of kings. God appointed me. I don't need to listen to anybody else. I can decide everything all by myself. I'm not under the law. I'm above the law because I'm appointed by God and have the divine right of kings. Anyway, didn't go down very well here, and he got his head cut off. But a long time before that, people decided we don't want that kind of a leader. We don't want someone who's going to make all the decisions all by themselves. Nobody has the authority. It's not biblical. And so in England, they had something called the Witan. Later we get the Wittengemot, which is the ruler didn't have the authority to make any decisions by himself without, first of all, having a council of elders. And so the elders, they find some kind of problem or some kind of issue going on, usually in relationships with France, didn't get on with them so well, or something else. And then all the wise men, who were the elders from the country, the community, the nation, they would all have a conversation, a discussion, a debate, an argument about it. They'd all come up with different ideas about how things should be solved. And the king couldn't say anything. All he could do was listen. And then eventually, when the conversation and all settled, then the king should have been able to recognize, okay, this is what everybody agrees about, and that's what we're going to do. So the king then, he had to listen to this kind of advice. He couldn't make decisions outside the council of elders. And so this later on became what we now call parliament. And so you have a prime minister, which is actually the queen or king's first minister. Anyway, so that's the way it works. You can't do things by yourself. You need to have support. And also, leadership's about the future. Going somewhere. If you're leading an army, you have to think, okay, this is what we're going to do. You have to give an inspiring speech to all the soldiers about fighting the other tribe or the other nation. This is why we're fighting, this is what we're going to do, etc., etc. Or some kind of vision about the future. Yes, Moses did, leaving Egypt, slavery in Egypt, going into Canaan, live a life of freedom, a different kind of society. This kind of vision is what people need to be able to inspire them to work hard, to invest themselves into the future. So it's very much, again, something to think about. Also, leaders learn. So again, this is Moses speaking here. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, assuming you want to have a king, anyway, basically any leader, he's to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests. So the king himself, he had to make his own copy of the Torah or the Bible. He had to write out for himself all the laws. And when you write it out yourself, you tend to remember it. It is to be set with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life. So every morning, the king had to get up and do hunduke, which meant reading the Mosaic law and reading the Bible, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and to follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. So again, this is the idea here. The king has to obey the law. The king doesn't have the authority to make the law or to create new laws. All he has to do is to make sure he knows the law and he follows the law and he supports the law and implements the law within the country. So if you're going to be a judge, you have to know the law. If you're going to make decisions, you have to be well educated. And so again, when Joshua became Moses' successor, Moses said to him, keep this book of the law always on your lips, meditate on it day and night. And so that's why it's incredibly important that a leader should be well educated, to study the scripture. But it's not enough in this world in which we're living just to study the scripture, although to be perfectly honest, the Bible is the book of books. It's the best book in the entire world to read and to study, because everything is in there that you need to know about everything. People actually read it. But also have to understand the world in which you're living. So when issue comes up, you have to make a good decision. So generally speaking, some presidents and leaders make good decisions because they're well educated. Churchill, for example, he had to make some decisions. He wasn't very good at making some decisions, but he was very good at making other decisions because he understood this is the way the world works and this is what we ought to do. Nixon also made some good decisions on an international politics level, made some rubbish decisions about some other things, got himself into trouble. Reagan also was very well educated. People thought he was just an actor, but actually he had read a huge amount of political philosophy and literature. Mrs. Thatcher is also incredibly well educated. And you get people who become leaders who are not so well educated. Cameron wasn't particularly, nor was Osborne, made huge mistakes in relationship with China and various other things. Boris Johnson had all kinds of problems, but he made some good decisions. He was the only politician who's willing to actually implement the democratic process. Britain voted to leave the EU. Nobody else wanted to do that. He was the only one who respected the vote and was willing to implement that. Very important, to listen to what the people want. And then he made some other good decisions about getting involved in Ukraine, and some other important decisions about lockdown and vaccines and various other things too. And then we have our current Prime Minister, who, to be perfectly honest, is not very good at making good decisions. Very a shame. Anyway, got lots of problems going on. So leaders need to be well educated, need to learn. So if you ever go to, anybody here go to National Trust properties? If you go to some of these houses, these mansions that are owned by former prime ministers, you walk in and they have a library, usually about 20, 30, 40, 50,000 books. They just read. So all they did was read. And that's what Father did a lot. He read a lot. It's really important to study and to read if you're going to be a leader. And so when Matthew became the national, started getting involved, becoming a pastor, I said, well, if you want to do this, you need to go and study, a degree in science. So I said, you need to go and get a degree in theology. So I went and studied at Harrow. And it makes a huge difference. One really needs to study. Because you have to make decisions. To make decisions, you have to know the way things are. Leadership means believing the people you lead. Let your members, this is Father speaking here, he wrote a very good, gave loads of good speeches. This one was to MFT captains in the late 70s. Let your members give suggestions about the best method to use and give comments about themselves. If you're confident of having the best way, do not just insist that your members follow your way. If one of them comes up to suggest his own idea, Even if you think he's wrong, do not say, no, just hush up and listen to me. Hush up's very polite. Shut up would we normally. Rather, try to find the good points in his suggestion and agree with him on those. If you come to realize someone is actually better than you in some ways, then you can always accept suggestions from him. So again, it's interesting here, Father's idea of leadership. You should listen. Yeah, this is the way it was here. The king has to listen, before making decisions. You have to listen and find out who's got the best idea. It may be you, but it may be somebody else. And one of the things struck me about Alan Sugar, the computer guy, is his apprentice, isn't it? Yeah. He didn't go to university, as far as I'm aware. He left school, I think, when he was 15 or 16. But he started this be incredibly successful. And I think one of the reasons why he's able to be that successful, because he surrounded himself with people who were better educated and more knowledgeable than he was. Yeah, that's really important to make sure, okay, I'm good at this, but not very good at that. So I need to find somebody who's really good at that, that's actually much better at that than I am. That's a really important thing about being a leader. You have to recognize your own strengths and weaknesses and find other people who can complement and support your weaknesses. So it means, in that case, believing the people you lead. You have to believe in them and have faith in them. It's really important. But to be perfectly honest, leadership is stressful and emotionally demanding. So this is Moses. He went through all kinds of incredible difficulties. Sometimes the whole thing fell apart. He wanted to go from Egypt into Canaan. The people spent a lot of time complaining, not enough food to go around, not enough water, this problem and that problem, the other problem. And the problem was they always kept on asking him to solve the problems. That was, because they were having to get from the state of being a slave, where they're just doing as they were told, to being a free person and making the decisions themselves, taking responsibility for their own lives, instead of expecting him to make all the decisions and to do everything. So Moses said to God, one of the most interesting things about the Bible is that these conversations that the prophets had with God is all recorded there. This is what he said to God. And then God replied to him a bit later on. Did I conceive all these people? Did I give birth to them? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? I cannot carry all these people all by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, then do not let me face my own ruin. So he's basically having a nervous breakdown with God and telling God he's burnt out, he's going to collapse. He thinks it's all God's fault because God has asked him to do this impossible mission. I feel sorry for poor old Mike, He's a leader of 72 countries in the UME region, plus the national leader of the UK. It's just ridiculous, to be honest. If I was Mike, I would go and say this is a true mother. It's a natural thing to say. You get burnt out, you get worn out. It's miserable being a leader, to be honest. I don't, not for me personally. I'm really quite happy the way things are. We've got Chris and Judith and lots of other people and Raymond to do all the things, which in days gone by, previous leaders had to do the whole thing all by themselves. But I'm really lazy and I like other people to do lots of these things. Not that I'm very good at doing lots of things. But, this is just the reality, and it's not an easy thing to do. And so one of the great things about being a prime minister in Britain is you can go and see the king, or previously the queen, once a week. And the prime ministers used to say they could go and speak to the Queen Elizabeth, and they could just unburden themselves about all the troubles and difficulties they were having. And they knew the Queen would never tell anybody what they'd said to her. And at the same time, they knew that she, because of all the experience she'd been through, could give them wise wisdom. And so I think one of them said, they went to the Queen and said, the economy's collapsing and this and all these problems. And she said, I remember this. I remember every prime minister tells me exactly the same thing. The country's collapsing and the economy's going down the drain, et cetera, but it all works out in the end. Don't worry about it. And so it was an incredible thing to have someone like that you can actually go and talk to. So things work out like this, hopefully. You need someone like that who you can actually go and share with. And for Moses, the person he shared with was his older sister. He used to pour out his heart to his older sister and have his nervous breakdowns with his older sister. And then one day, she died. And this is, Moses himself is completely grief-stricken. His sister died. Yeah. And the next day, people complained there wasn't enough water. And Moses went to talk to God, not enough water. God said to him, go and speak to the rock. But actually, Moses struck the rock twice. He'd lost it. Why did he lose it? He was grief-stricken. His sister died the day before. So that's why he lost control of his emotions. Yeah, so it's really very important to have someone like that you can rely upon, you can share your heart with, someone you can just pour out your heart, so you can appear in front of all the people, looking really wise and really sensible, and really at peace and calm. But, you need a bit of privacy, you can just go and say other things. Okay, so leadership also involves a sense of timing and pace. Moses said to the Lord, so Moses then, he'd been the leader for a long time, 40 years, he wanted to retire, been 120 years old, well into more than just an old age pensioner. And Moses said to the Lord, so, you look at the King Charles. He started work in his late 60s, when everybody else basically in the country retired. Finally, he had no choice, it's just the way it is. And Prince Philip eventually retired. He said, I've been working on a public life for 65 years, now I think I'm going to retire. Most people retire when they're 65 years old. I'm going to retire when I've done public work for 65 years. So he's in his mid-80s, having done public work since he was 20 and joined the Navy. So Moses said to the Lord, may the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in. So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. You might wonder, first of all, a sheep without a shepherd, you need someone like that. Now, what's this about going in and going out? So, going out means you're leading the people somewhere in a particular direction. But the thing that's most important, you have to realize, you have to think, well, actually, people are coming along with me. You can't get too far out, Otherwise, it's the end. So the idea here to bring them in, so, going in and out, so always being aware of what's really going on. So you can see some leaders, if they're not like that, they get killed. You look at what happened to Gandhi. He wanted to go too far, and so somebody within his own party, Hindu, killed him. He was a Hindu. Anyway, his relationship with Pakistan, Muslims. You look at what happened to Rabin, president or prime minister of Israel, who's making a peace arrangement with Egypt. He went too far for the very conservative Israelis who felt you've gone too far in making peace, and so he got killed by an Israeli. These sort of things happen. You have to be aware, and that's why Arafat wasn't killed, because he realized if I go that extra step, one of the Palestinians is going to kill me. It's the way it is. So as a leader then, you have to be very much aware you're leading a group. If they're not following you, you're going to be dead. So that's why this idea here, you have to point someone over to go out and come in before them. So always being aware, always listening, always being aware of people's reality and situation. The same with our own community. Father spent a huge amount of time giving long speeches before going anywhere and doing anything, because he wanted to feel he had the support of people. So right at the end of his speech, he'd always say, do you all agree with me? We'd all say, yeah. But that was, for him, is incredibly important that all the decisions he made and all the things that he did, that he had the support of all the members that he was speaking to at the time. Really important. You can't think, oh, I'm the leader, therefore I can decide this, this, and this. You actually have to go around and invest a huge amount of time in persuading people to support you. And that's what good politicians do as well. They have this vision. Mrs. Thatcher was like that. She drove some people totally round the bend, but she was able to motivate people to do things. So again, this is also important sense of timing and pace. So if you become the new leader of the UK movement, you can't think, well, I've got all these ideas and ideals about things I want to do, and we're going to do that. And everyone says, no, we're not in that space to be able to do that. First of all, you need to educate people to get into that space where you think they ought to be, and everybody needs to be there. And at that point, you can start to go forwards. I've always respected Mike. It's always been like this. Ever since, I remember fundraising with him, and same fundraising team in 1979. Always on the same page about everything. So, there we are. Can't think of anything else to say, to be honest. Anyway, so we're all leaders in some way or another. Maybe in a family, maybe in our school, maybe in our community, maybe in our business. Wherever you find yourself, you always a leader in some way or another, which means making decisions, making choices. And the thing is to be well educated and make good choices. And also to get the people who you're with to agree, explain to them what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it. Okay, that now we understand, so we can follow, we can put our heart into this, we can really invest ourselves in this, because we understand what's happening, what's going on. So that's very, very important. And so when as a parent, you need to explain to your children, this is why we're doing this. This is why I'm moving from one country to another country. Do you think this is a good idea, etc., etc. And very important. I made so many mistakes myself, and not to explain to people what I wanted to do. Anyway, there you go. Finished. So thank you very much, and bye everybody. And I hope you have a good week. Thank you.